I've been with tribal police long enough to understand that silence has its own language. Out here, on the Navajo Nation, it speaks more than most people ever will. I've come to respect that. I don't usually talk about the things I've seen, because most of them can be written off as stress, fatigue, or the way the desert reshapes your sense of scale. But there are a few events I still carry with me. Not because they were violent or dramatic, but because they were quiet. They stayed calm when I couldn't. They watched when I wasn't ready to be seen. I've never fully understood what happened, but I know when something doesn't belong. And I know when the land has decided not to answer back. Please subscribe to the Last Witness Files to support my work. It truly helps me continue. When I first took the oath, I believed that my job was as straightforward as any other form of law enforcement. Maintain order, protect the people, write reports, respond to calls. Out here, calls are fewer, but the distances make up for it. A domestic disturbance 10 miles out into the Clay Hills might as well be a different state. Night driving becomes a habit. You learn to trust your headlights more than your instincts. Back then, we were already stretched thin. Long patrols meant long hours with the radio murmuring occasionally between long spells of static. The roads were familiar. Washboard dirt, scattered tire ruts, sand drifts collecting along the edges. I used to think the land was empty. I don't think that anymore. The first time I noticed anything was during winter patrol. I had been assigned to check on remote homesteads, just presence patrols, no real expectation of trouble. Snow had drifted around the brush, collecting in shadows, leaving the mesas dusted like old bones. I kept my heater low to stay alert. The wind pressed against the cruiser, constant, low, like it wanted to remind me I wasn't supposed to be out there. The call didn't come through as a standard dispatch. It was informal, a relative asking through another officer if someone could drive out a check on an elderly couple who lived near the canyon line. They weren't answering the phone. That wasn't unusual. Service is spotty, and many elders prefer privacy. But there was concern, enough that it stuck. Their home wasn't on a map. A dirt road breaks off from the highway. Then another breaks from that, eventually becoming nothing more than a path broken by repeated use. You navigate by memory, by landmarks, by the shape of the land. I've been there once, years back. I remembered the way the canyon opened up just beyond their property, like the world had been split. As I drove, the sky thinned into evening. Colors drained. The world became gradients of blue and slate. The radio breathed softly behind me. Occasionally a voice. Mostly nothing. There is a point out there, and anyone who patrols this land will tell you, when the quiet becomes structured, it stops being the absence of sound and becomes something layered, as if there are rooms within it, as if someone else is listening, just not speaking. I found the homestead by the weak glow of my headlights reflecting off an old truck hood propped up against a fence. No lights inside the house. No sign of movement. My training kept me calm. Approach slowly. Observe. Announce presence. My voice sounded small against the open sky. Tribal police, I called out. Wind, answered by brushing past the dry wood of the porch. I knocked. The sound was hollow. The door opened a fraction from the pressure. That wasn't good. I announced again. No reply. I stepped inside. I had been in many homes, some abandoned, some simply neglected. This one was different in a way that wasn't immediately obvious. Everything was in its place. Blankets folded, dishes washed, shoes lined near the doorway. It felt paused rather than empty, as if the occupants had simply stepped outside for a moment and forgot to return. I checked room by room. Nothing. No signs of struggle. No blood. No disturbance. But I kept hearing something. Not a sound exactly, but the sense that something had just moved out of view, as if I had arrived a second too late to catch it. I stepped outside and scanned the perimeter with my flashlight. The beam cut across the open land and then was swallowed by it. The canyon edge wasn't far, maybe 200 yards beyond the property. A long, dark slit in the earth. Even in low light, you could feel its presence. Tracks in the snow caught my attention. 2 sets, adult-sized, parallel, leaving the house and heading toward the canyon. Not returning. My training told me to radio in. My instincts told me to stay quiet for a moment longer. So I did. The prints were recent. Edges sharp. not yet softened by drifting snow. They walked at a normal pace. No signs of running, no struggle, just walking, side by side. I followed them with my light. The wind rustled the sagebrush. The horizon felt distant. My boots made the only clear noise, crunching into the snow, marking a second path beside theirs. The closer I got to the canyon, the more the air seemed to thin. Not colder exactly, just emptier, like sound refused to travel. When the tracks reached the edge, they didn't hesitate. They didn't turn. They didn't pause. They just ended. I stepped closer and aimed my flashlight downward. The canyon swallowed the beam. There was only blackness, then the faintest suggestion of rock far below. I stood there for a long time, listening. Nothing. No wind now. No night sounds. Just an impression, as if the land itself was waiting to see what I would do next. I called it in after that. I used neutral language. Missing persons. Possible fall. Request for assistance. I didn't mention the silence. There's no checkbox for that. Backup was an hour out. So I waited. The night deepened. The stars sharpened. My flashlight became less useful as my eyes adjusted. And that was when I heard it, distant but carried cleanly across the canyon. My name, spoken slowly, not shouted, not urgent, just said, as if someone I knew had called to me from across a small room. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me. No one. The radio crackled then, sudden, sharp, making me flinch. A voice came through, routine, unaware of what had just happened, and the land went quiet again. I didn't respond to the voice. That may sound strange, but training teaches you something important. Don't react until you understand what you're reacting to. Out here, echoes carry in unusual ways. A name can drift from a radio, from a passing ranch truck, from a house you didn't realize was nearby. At least, that's what I told myself while I steadied my breathing and kept my eyes on the canyon edge. I keyed the mic and gave my location again. My voice sounded normal, controlled, professional. I didn't mention what I'd heard, not because I want to hide it, but because I didn't know what it was yet. I wanted facts before I reported feelings. Backup arrived just before full dark. 2 units. Both men I trusted. One of them had been at this longer than I had. We did what procedure requires. Perimeter check, scene photos, marking of prints, and an initial scan with spotlights. The beam dropped into the canyon again and again, illuminating fractured walls, scrub brush, clinging to stone, and a vast dark below where the river threaded like wire. The senior officer stood next to me for a while without speaking. He's the kind of man who waits before forming conclusions. Eventually, he said, "Looks like they walked out together." "Yeah," I replied. We both looked at the end of the prints. He knelt down, gloved hand hovering over them. Clean. No drag. No hesitation. They didn't come back. He nodded once. Search and rescue was called in for the next morning. Rope. Thermal. Formal grid. We all agreed night search here was unsafe. I didn't sleep that night. I went home. I showered. I sat at my table and listened to the refrigerator hum. Every so often, I replayed the sound of my name being spoken across the canyon. The voice had been ordinary, warm, familiar in a way I couldn't place. Not a whisper, not eerie, just mine, shaped the way people say it when they've known you long enough to soften the vowels. When daylight came, I joined the search team. Helicopter passes revealed nothing. Rope descent was slow and methodical. The canyon is deceptive. Its floor is uneven, broken by boulders and brush. If someone fell, the land would keep them for a while. We found nothing. No bodies, no clothing, no blood, no signs of animals. Just emptiness where 2 people should have been. Protocol followed. Reports filed. Family notified. Cultural liaisons involved. Grief moved through the community in quiet waves. You learn to stand still for that, to be present without trespassing on private mourning. I've always tried to respect that boundary. The case remained open. Missing persons, unknown circumstances. Life went on, but the land didn't forget. Weeks later, I was on night patrol along the same stretch of road. It was late enough that the world had narrowed to the tunnel of my headlights. Static pressed soft against the radio. My mind drifted the way it sometimes does during long drives. Not unfocused, just looser, like you're listening more than thinking. That was when I saw it. A figure standing at the fence line near the canyon road. Not flagging me down. Not moving. Just standing. I slowed. My hand rested on the door. Breath steady. Procedure first. I lit them up with the spotlight. A wash of white across the brush and wire. No one there. The world returned to shadow. I sat for a moment, listening to the engine idle. The thing about working in law enforcement out here is that you learn to differentiate between fear and awareness. Fear is noisy. Awareness is quiet. This wasn't fear. It was the sensation you get when you enter a room and know immediately you're not alone. I stepped out of the vehicle, boots crunching the dirt. The air was still. Moonlight pulled pale lines across the land. I scanned slowly, methodically. Nothing. Then, without ceremony, the radio whispered my name again. Same tone, same cadence. Calm, familiar. But this time, I was holding the mic, and the channel was silent. No one was transmitting. I stood there for a long moment with the mic in my hand, listening to the sound of my own breathing. Eventually, I logged it as an audio anomaly. That's the language we use when something doesn't make sense. After that, I started noticing small details I had previously ignored. Radio static would sometimes rise and fall rhythmically, like breathing. The wind near the canyon rim would stop abruptly when I approached, as if it were stepping aside. Tracks would appear near homesteads that led nowhere. Not human tracks, not animal, just impressions of weight in the snow or dust. Enough to suggest presence, not enough to define it. I kept working. You always do. There's a certain pressure to remain rational in this job, especially when others already stereotype the land as mystical or haunted. I don't indulge in stories. I don't pretend to understand what belongs to culture or ceremony. Those things deserve respect, and they exist outside the jurisdiction of my badge. My responsibility is safety, welfare, law. But there are times when you sense that the land has its own system, one far older and indifferent to our categories. Months passed. Then the second case happened. A single man this time. Middle-aged. Reliable. Worked livestock. Known to travel the back roads alone. Last seen fueling up at a small gas station near the mesas. He joked with the clerk. Bought coffee. Thanked her. Drove away. He didn't arrive where he was going. When his truck was found, it was parked neatly at a turnout overlooking the canyon. Doors locked. Keys on the seat. Thermos in the holder. No sign of struggle. Tracks again. One set. Walking from the truck to the canyon edge. Stopping. Ending. I responded to that call with 2 other officers and a ranger from Federal Land Services. We stood together at the rim, staring at emptiness. The ranger, younger than me but seasoned, said quietly, he walked. Yeah, I answered. He didn't say anything else for a while. Then, wasn't the first. I looked at him. He didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the horizon, as if talking directly to the land. Something tightened behind my ribs. That night, while the search teams combed the canyon again, I stayed near the rim to control the scene. Radios crackled. Headlamps swung through darkness below like slow, patient insects. And then, again my name. This time closer, almost conversational. I turned slowly. The wind carried sage scent. The sky was rimmed with stars, so clear it hurt to look at them. No one was there, but I realized something then that unsettled me more than the voice itself. It wasn't calling from the canyon anymore. It was calling from the land beside me, from ground level, as if whatever had been watching from below had learned where to stand. I didn't tell anyone about the voice that time, either. Not because I was afraid of ridicule. Most of the men and women I work with have at least one story they don't share in reports, but because I didn't yet understand what category it belonged in. If I wrote it down, it would become real in a way I wasn't prepared to acknowledge. So instead, I did what procedure allows. I stayed at my post, observed, and made note of objective details only. Still, the awareness didn't fade. You might imagine this kind of thing arrives like a shock. It doesn't. It settles gradually. First it's a thought you dismiss, then a presence you rationalize. By the time you realize you've accepted it, as part of the landscape. It's already woven into your daily routine. I kept patrolling. The canyons cut deep through this part of the nation. Quiet fractures in the earth where wind travels differently, where your own footsteps sound muted, as if the land doesn't want to carry them. There are stories, yes, old ones, not for me to repeat, and not the kind you share casually. Most elders won't explain them unless you belong to that knowledge, and I respect that boundary. What matters here is this. People have always understood that the land remembers. That memory is not metaphorical. It is lived. It is carried. In law enforcement, you learn to compartmentalize. Scene, evidence, family, report. You place each piece in an ordered mental space so you don't drown in it later. But sometimes, those compartments start to leak. The canyon cases were beginning to seep through the seams. There were now 3 open files. One couple, one man, all apparently calm when they left. No signs of harm, no predictable pattern beyond the same geography. I started volunteering for patrol near the canyon roads more often. I told myself it was practical. Familiarity improves response time. But what I was really doing was watching, listening, waiting for the land to explain itself. It didn't. Instead, things became quieter. One evening in late spring, I pulled off at a small overlook I've used many times to drink coffee and stretch my legs. From there, the canyon opens up in a wide, quiet arc. The brush grows low and silver with dust. The wind carries the faint rattle of dry stems knocking together. That night, the air was still. So still, I could hear the soft tap of my boot against the gravel. I left the engine idling. I walked to the rim and looked out. When you stare into a canyon long enough, you begin to lose scale. The walls drift closer. The floor drifts farther away. Sound changes. Your heartbeat becomes louder than the wind. I stood there until my body began to register that I was unprotected, a simple animal on the edge of a drop. And that was when I saw movement below. Not much, just a shift of shadow between rocks. At first, I thought it might be one of the search team markers, a reflective patch or a stale ribbon catching moonlight. But it moved with intention, not towards me, not away, simply repositioning, as if trying to see better. I narrowed my eyes and waited for the logical explanation to present itself. It didn't. Instead, the radio on my shoulder exhaled static. Then I heard my name again, but there was something new. It wasn't just repeating me. It was correcting the way I say it, the rhythm, the weight of it, as if the land itself had been practicing. I didn't answer. I let the quiet absorb it, and after a long moment, the static faded. When I returned to my cruiser, the engine felt louder than usual, mechanical, ordinary, something human made to hold on to. I sat for a while and wrote down my observations privately, not for the department, for myself. Distance, time, location, environmental notes. I'm not a superstitious man, but I respect documentation. If something's happening, you want a clean record of your own perception. Over the following weeks, I noticed another shift. Missing person calls increased, but most were resolved within hours. Young people out late, a broken down vehicle, a miscommunication. But each time I drove those roads, I felt a pressure behind the silence, like a question I didn't yet know how to ask. Then one night, dispatch requested welfare check on an older shepherd who hadn't responded to his son's calls. The small trailer he lived in sat near a grazing area not far from the canyon line. I'd been there once before. Good man, quiet, polite, the kind of person who thanks you even when you don't do much. I arrived near dusk. His dogs greeted me first. Nervous, circling, not aggressive but alert. Animals know more than they share. They weren't barking at me. They were watching the horizon. I walked to the trailer and knocked. No answer. Door locked. Windows dark. I checked the surrounding area. The pen was closed. Tools in their place. Nothing overturned. No signs of distress. But there was something else. A stillness, so complete it felt heavy. Footprints. Again, led away from the home. Single set. Calm stride. Straight toward the canyon. My breath slowed. Not from fear, from alignment. I already knew what I'd find. I followed them to the rim. They ended at the edge. I stood there, my boots aligned with his last visible step, and looked out across a darkness that didn't want to be measured. I said his name once, softly, not as a challenge, as respect. The answer came not from below, not from the wind, but from behind me, in the same careful tone I'd been hearing for months. Except this time, it didn't use my name. It used his, perfectly, with the small inflection his family used. I didn't turn around right away. Training told me, don't rush. Don't reveal your own fear. Assess. But something in the air had changed. The land was no longer imitating. It was remembering. I turned slowly. The brush shifted. Shadows remained shadows. There was no one there. But I could feel it. Not a presence in the human sense, but a kind of attention. Like the earth had narrowed its focus to this exact point. I reported the scene. We called for search units again. We followed protocol. We did the work we always do. Thorough, dignified, with as much compassion as the job allows. And again, we found nothing. The file joined the others. At home, my sleep became shallow. Not restless, watchful. I'd wake in the small hours with the sense that something had spoken, but by the time I sat up, the room was empty and still. Occasionally, I'd think I heard my name from the kitchen or down the hall, but there was never anyone there. I stopped turning on the lights when that happened. Light didn't change anything. Instead, I listened, and I realized something that unsettled me more than any voice. It was getting better at sounding human. The cadence refined, the pauses more natural, the tone shifting according to context, softer at night, more neutral during patrol, not mocking, not threatening, learning, and always using names. Never titles, never ranks. Names, like I wanted to be precise. Around that time, one of our senior officers, the same man who had studied the first set of tracks, asked me during a long drive if I'd ever had the feeling that the land paid attention. He said it lightly, neutral tone, careful. I didn't answer immediately. Eventually, I said, I think it remembers. He nodded, eyes forward. We didn't speak again for miles. Some silences are respectful. Some are necessary. But others feel like the land is listening in, and you don't want to say too much in case it learns more than you intend to give. There's a point in certain investigations where the incident stops being a single event and becomes a pattern. When that happens in normal law enforcement work, you form a task group, compare data, and develop theories. Out here, the pattern was quieter. No one announced it. No meeting was called. But every so often, I would see the same names appear on internal emails, the same officers assigned to the same geography, the same tired looks passed between us in briefings. We didn't say it out loud, but we all knew the canyon was taking people. That's not an official statement. It never will be. But there are truths that exist parallel to policy. Quiet, lived truths that everyone acknowledges without putting into writing. The canyon cases belong to that category. I kept working them when assigned, and when I wasn't, I still found myself drifting back to those roads. Some part of me wanted to witness whatever was happening, not to stop it. I wasn't arrogant enough to believe I could, but to understand it. Understanding is a form of control. Even a small amount can steady you. I started taking more detailed notes, privately, in a notebook I kept sealed in a drawer at home. I recorded environment, time, weather, phase of the moon, visibility, wind direction, radio anomalies, and personal subjective impressions, clearly labeled as such. If my mind was losing clarity, I wanted a trail to follow back. One afternoon, clear skies, late summer heat, I was dispatched to a call from a hiker who claimed to have seen someone standing on a narrow ledge inside one of the side canyons. The hiker had shouted, tried to offer help, but the figure had not responded. When the hiker returned with others, the ledge was empty. Normally, this would be filed under misperception, light, distance, nerves. But given the ongoing open cases, we responded. I arrived with a ranger and 2 search and rescue members. We hiked in carefully, radios checked, ropes ready, keeping a respectful distance from the edge. The canyon walls rose on both sides like old ribs, worn smooth by time and water. The air was cooler inside, touched by the memory of shade. When we reached the ridge the hiker had described, I saw the ledge, a narrow stone shelf maybe 30 feet down, too thin to stand on comfortably. No clear access route. Even an experienced climber would hesitate. There was nothing there now. The ranger studied the rock face with binoculars. His jaw tightened slightly. "You see that?" he asked. I followed his gaze. On the ledge, faint, almost worn away, were impressions in the dust. Not shoes, bare feet, side by side, toes pointed outward toward the drop. No scuff marks, no signs of someone climbing down. Just placement, standing, waiting. I said nothing. There wasn't anything to say. We documented it. We filed reports. We left. That night, during patrol, the radio stayed clear for hours. The sky was cloudless, a hard, bright scatter of stars across the dark. When you've spent enough time alone on back roads, you develop a sense of when something has shifted around you, like the temperature dropping suddenly before rain. That feeling came over me again as I approached the canyon overlook. My headlights swept across the pullout, empty, and then passed across something that didn't reflect the way it should have. I slowed, reversed, stopped. There at the edge of the turnout were footprints, bare, human, cleanly defined in the dust. They walked toward the canyon and ended. Again. But this time, something else was different. Beside the last print, in the exact place a person might stand to steady themselves before looking out, was a second impression. Not a foot, not an animal, just weight, as if the ground itself had pressed down. I crouched beside it, studying the compressed dust. It was subtle, but it was real. There are unwritten rules in this job. One of them is this: do not assign intention where evidence cannot support it. So I didn't, but I wrote down what I observed, precisely, clinically. When I straightened, the air felt strangely thin. The radio clicked softly. Then, calmly, gently, my name. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The voice spoke again, not louder, not closer, but more confident. It shaped my name exactly the way my late grandmother used to. Same cadence, same quiet patience. She had been gone for years. The wind didn't move. The brush didn't sway. It was as though the land held its breath, not to frighten me, but to see what I would do. I said aloud softly, "I hear you." Not a challenge, not a surrender, just acknowledgement. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of attention. After a moment, the radio returned to static and ambient murmur. A weather update from a distant tower. A routine call. Normal life resuming. But the edge of things had shifted. From that night onward, the names it used multiplied. Sometimes, while I was assisting families in missing person cases, I would hear it, faint, almost shy, repeating the names they spoke. Never in front of them, never in a way that intruded. Only later, only when I was alone, and always with perfect accuracy, as though the land was collecting us, learning, practicing. One evening, after a call that ended peacefully, a lost teenager found safe with relatives, I returned to my cruiser and sat in the driver's seat longer than necessary. I could feel that subtle attention again, as if the space around the vehicle had become aware of the interior. I said carefully, "Why names?" I didn't expect an answer. I didn't receive one, but the radio hiss softened, like someone exhaling. I began to understand something then, not as a fact, but as a feeling. Whatever lived within or beneath that canyon wasn't hunting. It wasn't angry. It wasn't benevolent either. It was curious, and we had given it something to study. Us. Names are how we anchor ourselves. They are how we call each other back. They are how we remember. The land had begun to do the same. Around this time, an elder requested to speak with me privately, not about the cases explicitly, but about my patrol area. He didn't ask me what I'd seen. He didn't tell me stories. He only said, with calm gravity, "Some places are older than memory. You don't fill them with your thoughts. You let them think on their own." I nodded. I didn't push for more. He wasn't warning me off. He was reminding me of boundaries. And perhaps he sensed that the land was no longer silent in the way it once had been. After that conversation, I became more deliberate about my presence. When I patrolled near the canyon, I spoke less. I turned the radio down when unnecessary. I walked to the edge only when required. I try not to give it more than it was already taking. But awareness is not a thing you can return. Once you know you're being watched, not maliciously, not even personally, you carry that knowledge with you. It changes the way you walk. It changes the way you listen. And it changes the way you say your own name. Because you never know, anymore, who else is learning how to say it too. Patterns kept forming, and I kept pretending they were isolated events. That's part of the discipline of this work. You don't jump to conclusions. You don't feed fear. You ground yourself in what is present, what is observed, what can be documented. But there were nights when the silence out there pressed so fully against my thoughts that it felt dishonest to call it coincidence. The canyon wasn't just a place anymore. It was a participant. I noticed the change most clearly during a late autumn patrol. The air had begun to thin with the first hints of winter. Frost gathered around the brush before dawn, turning the ground pale and brittle. The sky that night was clouded, a soft, dim ceiling that reflected the faintest glow of distant towns like memory rather than light. It was a quiet shift. No calls, no traffic, just the slow rhythm of tires over gravel and dirt. Then dispatch came through with a request. Welfare check on a young woman reported missing by her brother. Last contact, a voicemail. Tone calm, words simple. She had said she needed to go listen to the land for a while. That alone wouldn't normally trigger a response. Many people here spend time alone on purpose. But she hadn't returned, and the family, who knew her habits well, grew uneasy. Last triangulated signal placed her vehicle within a few miles of the canyon road. I found a car pulled neatly off to the side. Hazard lights off, doors locked, purse inside, shoes carefully placed on the passenger seat. A folded blanket rested across the back. Nothing chaotic, nothing out of place, just absence. I stood by the vehicle for a long moment before investigating further. Not because I was hesitant, but because the air felt aware, like a room in which a conversation had just ended. I called the situation in and followed protocol. Flashlights sweeping in slow arcs. Wide field, controlled breathing. Then I saw them. Bare footprints in the frost-dusted ground. Light, unhurried, walking in a straight line toward the canyon. No return path. I followed, slowly, my boots crushing softly through the frozen surface layers. The air sharpened inside my chest. The land grew quieter with every step. Halfway to the rim, the prints paused, as if she had stood there for a moment, deciding. Then they continued, and ended at the edge, like all the others. But this time, something else accompanied the prints. A second trail, not footprints, just weight, matching step for step, sometimes closer, sometimes slightly apart, not leading, not following, walking beside. I crouched near the last marked impression and studied the ground. The frost had been pressed flat, the dirt beneath compacted as though by pressure without form. Standing there beside her, together, looking out. I don't often speak aloud on scene unless necessary. But that night, the silence was so heavy it asked for response. So, quietly, I said the missing woman's name. There was a delay, a full-body stillness. Then, from somewhere that felt both near and far, the land answered. Not with my voice, not with radio static, not with wind, but with her name, said carefully, gently, as though testing it for fit. The air didn't move. My breath did. Slow, measured. I didn't run. I didn't react. I did what I have always been trained to do. Observe, record, stabilize, and maintain the scene until others arrived. But as I stood there, I realized that the land had stopped practicing. It wasn't learning anymore. It was remembering fluently. Search teams arrived before dawn. We marked. We descended. We scanned. We followed every possible line of investigation. You could see the strain in the faces of the responders, people who have seen more than most. None of us said it, but we all understood. She had walked. She had chosen. And she had not returned. The case joined the others. That would be the end of it, ordinarily. Another quiet loss folded into the long, ongoing work of our department. Except that a week later, something changed in a way that unsettled me more deeply than anything prior. The land began to answer when it was not called. I was at home, off duty, The night was uneventful. I read for a while, made tea, turned off the lights, let the house sink into quiet. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my name. Not loud, not whispered, just present, spoken from the hallway with unmistakable intention. I lay still and listened. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no movement, just the faint creak of the structure in the cold. I got up, checked the house. Doors secure, windows locked, no signs of intrusion. And yet, the impression of being known lingered. Not invasive, not hostile, simply aware. I sat in the living room for a while, lights off, watching the slow shift of dark over darker shapes. When I closed my eyes, I could almost feel the land, not physically, but as a wide, quiet attention extending beyond my home, beyond the reservation boundary, beyond anything easily defined. I began to wonder whether the canyon was the source, or simply an opening, whether the land itself, older than borders, older than maps, had always been listening, and only now had begun to speak in a way we could recognize, and whether that recognition came at cost. I kept working. What else was there to do? But the cases continued, not daily, not in a wave, just steady enough to carry a pulse. Each time, calm departure, unhurried movement, names echoing afterward like the last note of a song. Sometimes, while standing near the rim at night, I would feel the subtle shift in the air and know before I heard anything that it was about to say another. Not calling for them, not calling to them, just remembering, as if reciting a growing list. I never corrected it. I never answered, except once, with that simple acknowledgement. I don't believe it needed my participation. It wasn't seeking conversation. It wasn't seeking faith. It wasn't, as far as I could tell, seeking anything at all. It was simply aware of us. And in becoming aware, it had started to gather the only thing that truly defined us on this land. Our names. One evening near winter, I returned to the overlook after a long shift. The sky was layered slate and deep blue. The wind moved in low, slow currents. And for the first time, I felt something close to grief on behalf of the land itself. As though whatever presence existed here had been lonely for longer than any human memory could contain, and had finally discovered a way to say, quietly, I see you. I know you. You walk here. You belong to this story now. I don't pretend to understand it. I don't embellish it. I don't assign meaning beyond what I have observed. But I know this. The land is not empty. It has never been empty. And what lives within it now knows how to speak our names. There comes a point where a story stops feeling like a sequence of events and becomes something you live inside of. I didn't realize that it already happened until one evening when I was driving the canyon road and caught myself saying goodnight to the land under my breath, the same way you would to a partner settling into sleep beside you. It wasn't ceremony. It wasn't superstition. It was acknowledgement, routine, familiarity. I didn't tell anyone. Some things aren't meant for conversation. The department remained professional. We handled each case as its own tragedy. Families were notified with care. Counseling resources offered. Ceremonies held. I stood back when appropriate and stepped forward when needed, knowing that my badge had limits, not only in authority, but in understanding. Respect matters here. Not every question is mine to ask, but privately, the pattern continued to sharpen. Names first. Footprints. Silence. Then nothing. The canyon didn't take people in violence. There were no signs of panic. No scuffles. No desperate trails. Just departure, calm as a slow breath out. One night, a storm sat over the mesas. A dark, heavy ceiling threaded with distant lightning. The radio carried weather advisories and the scattered conversations of other units finishing their shifts. I was nearly done with mine when dispatch reported a stalled vehicle near the canyon turnoff. Possible breakdown. No answer when called back. I responded. The road shimmered with thin mud, carrying the faint iron scent of wet dust. My headlights cut a narrow white corridor through the dark. The world beyond that beam no longer existed in detail, only in suggestion. When I arrived, I saw the truck parked neatly on the shoulder. Hazard lights blinking slow and patient. The interior was empty. Driver's door closed. keys sitting in the cup holder. A small paper bag from a roadside market rested on the passenger seat. Receipt tucked into the fold. I shut off my siren, but kept the lights low. I listened. Water gathered in the brush and fell in soft drops. Wind moved like a long exhale across the open land. There were no voices, no footsteps, no sounds of someone moving away through the dark. But I already knew where to look. Footprints in the damp soil, bare, unhurried, leading toward the rim. I followed, not quickly, not slowly, at the steady pace of someone walking beside a truth they already know. Halfway there, something shifted. A sound, faint, deliberate, like a breath shared close by. Then, not from the canyon, but from somewhere unplaceable, came a single word. Officer. Not my name, not anyone else's, just the title, said carefully, as though taste testing a new shape. I stopped. The hair along my arms lifted beneath my jacket. Until that moment, it had never used anything but names. I turned slightly, scanning the land. My flashlight cut across wet stone, brush, and darkness. Who's there? I asked, calm, professional, nothing more than a question. Silence. Then low, almost patient. Officer. Not mocking, not hostile, just trying the word on. I don't frighten easily. Years of responding to violence and grief will do that. But what I felt then wasn't fear. It was recognition. I understood roles now. Not just identities. Roles. Relationships. The structure of how we belong to one another. I continued to the rim. The prints ended at the edge, just like all the others. And beside the last step, there it was again, that weight without shape impression settling into the wet ground. Closer than before. Closer than felt comfortable. Standing beside. Not leading. Not following. With. Lightning flickered somewhere beyond the horizon. Dim and distant. For a moment, the sky opened to reveal the depth of the world. The canyon, the land, the unseen distances that stretch beyond any map. And I had the sudden, quiet realization that whatever this was had learned enough to stand right next to us, without being seen at all. I radioed the situation in. Units responded. Ranger services joined. We worked the case as we always did, controlled, compassionate, thorough. The missing man remained missing. Another name added to the list. Later, back at the station, one of the younger officers asked me, cautiously, whether I ever felt like the canyon was listening. He said it like a joke, but his eyes weren't joking. I didn't answer directly. Instead, I said, "Be respectful when you speak out there." He nodded. He understood more than he said. Weeks passed. The presence didn't fade. In fact, it began to refine itself. Sometimes, when I'd park near the rim for a few minutes before continuing patrol, I'd hear my name spoken almost conversationally. Not as a summons, not as echo, but with the gentle cadence of greeting. Good evening. Except it never used those words. Just my name, said the way a colleague might when stepping into a quiet room. Once, late at night, it spoke the name of another officer, someone long retired, and then fell silent, as though waiting to see if I'd respond. I didn't. Respectful silence is sometimes the only appropriate answer. I began to wonder, quietly, to myself, whether this presence had always been here, nameless and quiet, and that we had simply wandered too close to the boundary between our world and its awareness. Not supernatural, not folklore, just something that had no need to notice us until we started leaving parts of ourselves behind. Grief, memory, names spoken raw in the night air. Names carry weight. Maybe the land had finally learned how to lift them. Another winter rolled in. Snow softened the mesas into pale, muted shapes. Silence thickened. The canyon breathed cold into everything it touched. One evening, as I stood at the rim during a scene perimeter, the presence settled so close that I felt it. Not on my skin, not in sound, but inside the space where you usually carry your thoughts. A subtle alignment, a quiet turning of attention. Then, softly, carefully, it spoke my full name. First, middle, last, perfectly, as though reading it from a line carved somewhere below the earth. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply stood there, boots pressed into snow, the world held in a slow, suspended breath. It didn't repeat itself. It didn't intrude. It simply waited. And in that waiting, I understood something I had never considered before. Whatever lived within this land did not simply know our names. It was keeping them, not for control, not for threat, but as a record, a ledger, a remembrance, as if it feared that, one day, when no one remained to say them out loud, it alone would hold the last memory of who we had been here. I don't know if that thought frightened me or comforted me. Maybe both. The wind returned. The moment passed. Life resumed its steady, procedural rhythm. But nothing was the same after that. Not my patrols. Not my sleep. Not the way I heard my own name spoken. And I began to suspect that, whether I wanted it or not, I had already become part of whatever the land was keeping. The last case I worked that ties into all of this didn't begin as anything unusual. A weather front had moved through the previous night, leaving the air washed clean and cold. The sky felt high, as though the world had been opened wider than usual. I was on routine patrol, checking a series of isolated roads that skirted the canyon rim. Traffic was almost non-existent, just the occasional porch light in the distance, a reminder that people still lived and carried on their lives across all this quiet space. Dispatch called with a welfare request from a small family living out near the boundary of our patrol zone. Their uncle hadn't come home. His truck was missing. Last known location placed him somewhere near the canyon road. He was not a fragile man, not reckless. He'd worked livestock his entire life. He knew the land better than most. I acknowledged the call and headed in that direction. By then, the pattern was bone deep. I didn't speed. I didn't speculate. I let the road rise and fall beneath the cruiser and listened to the slow murmur of the radio, steady as breath. I found the truck just before dusk, pulled over neatly. Engine off, keys in the console. Inside, there was a jacket folded on the seat and a small paper bag of groceries beginning to sweat condensation along the sides. Nothing scattered, nothing broken, just an unfinished life paused mid-sentence. I stepped out of the cruiser and closed the door quietly. The air was still. There are times when the silence here widens until it feels almost physical. This was one of those times. As I began to circle the vehicle, I already sensed what I would see. Footprints, bare, unhurried, heading toward the canyon. And there, parallel, that second weight, invisible but undeniable, pressing faintly into the softened earth beside each step. Walking with him, I followed. The prints led straight toward the rim, without hesitation, without wandering. Sometimes people describe suicidal behavior as something messy or frantic, but these weren't like that. These tracks always felt resolved, as if the decision had been made long before the feet began to move. I reached the edge. The prints ended. The second impression ended beside them, and the land opened downward into a depth that never seems to finish. I reached for my radio, calm, procedural, and began to report the scene. Halfway through, the radio fell silent. Not static, not malfunction, just silence. And then, in that soft empty channel, I heard my name. Not loud, not intimate, just present, followed by another name. The missing man's. Then another, and another. A recitation. Names from every open file. Spoken slowly, carefully, accurately, as if the land were turning the pages of a book and reading aloud what it had recorded. I stood there listening. My fingers tightened slightly against the radio, but my breathing stayed even. Training holds, even when the world shifts beneath it. After a pause, it spoke my name again. Not asking, not calling, just holding it there in the air between us, like a shared understanding that couldn't be undone. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because in that moment, I realized something that I had been circling for months without naming. This wasn't about death. Not entirely. This was about witness. All my life in law enforcement has been defined by bearing witness to grief, to harm, to kindness, to resilience, to the complicated ways people love and fail and hurt and forgive. I have documented loss in sterile lines of text, filed under case numbers, and labeled with time and location and manner. But the land has its own record. Older, quieter, less forgiving, and it had begun, in its own way, to keep track of us, not as suspects or victims or officers, but as names spoken into open air, names with weight, names with history, names that would otherwise fade when the last person who knew how to say them was gone. Maybe those who walked did so because something inside them recognized that, consciously or not. Maybe they stepped to the edge and felt, for one quiet moment, utterly seen, utterly remembered. Maybe that was enough. Or maybe there are truths I will never understand, and the safest thing I can do is accept the limits of my role. Eventually, the radio returned to normal channel traffic, a weather report, a unit checking in 2 districts over, life resuming its ordinary shape. Backup arrived. We secured the scene. Search units descended, and, as always, they found nothing. The file remained open. Later, after the reports were written and the scene cleared, I drove back to the overlook alone and turned off the engine. The world fell into that deep, ancient quiet that has nothing to do with the absence of noise. I stepped out, walked toward the rim, and stood there with my hands in my pockets, feeling the cold settle into my bones. I said, softly, "I know you're there." The wind slowed. The land listened. And then, not through the radio, not through echo, but simply within the space where my thoughts usually form, I heard my name. Spoken not as a test, not as a rehearsal, but as acknowledgement, recognition. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I didn't question. I just stood there, letting the canyon and the sky and the weight of all that time rest around me. Because the truth is simple. I patrol Navajo land. I wear a badge. I follow procedure. I respect boundaries. And I know, with a certainty that doesn't require belief, that there is something here that remembers us now. Something that has learned our language, not to speak to us, but to keep us, quietly, carefully, without fanfare, a record etched into silence. And one day, when my own name is spoken for the last time by human lips, I have the distinct, heavy sense that the land will still whisper it back into the dark, not as threat, not as comfort, but as witness. The canyon doesn't shout. It doesn't chase. It doesn't demand. It simply waits and listens. And when we fall silent, it remembers. I don't share this to frighten anyone. I share it because sometimes the burden of witness becomes too heavy to carry alone. And because, in the end, that is all I am. A quiet observer, a tired officer, a man who has seen the land open its eyes and heard it learn our names.